By the start of the 20th century, the growth of printed media seemed unstoppable. Not only were existing formats such as magazines and comics flourishing, but they were joined by new concepts such as comic postcards and advertising, and colour printing became relatively commonplace for those with deep pockets. Illustrators in general, and cartoonists in particular, had never been as much in demand, and newer talents were emerging all the time. American illustrator T.S. Sullivan had begun his career at the tail end of the previous century, but he hit the peak of his popularity in the first decade of the 20th century. Sullivan was yet another immensely talented comedic pen and ink illustrator, whose profoundly influential anthropomorphic animals were the result of painstaking research. In Britain, John Hassell's career followed the same pattern. Although already well established, it was the 1900s which saw his good-natured images dominate all forms of media, most of it using his trademark bold outlines and posterised colour technique. Most famously, he created Skegness's Jolly Fisherman in 1908, and the character is still in use today. Tom Brown also seized as many opportunities as he could from the rapidly expanding market. So you were just as likely to see his work in comics such as Chips, in the pages of Punch and other magazines, on advertising posters and many comic postcards. The most radical stylistic development of the period was seen in the work of Austrian designer Julius Klinger. He pioneered a new abstracted and dynamic cartoon style which rejected tonal painting and crosshatched shading completely. In American comic strips, one of the biggest early successes was Bud Fischer's Mutt and Jeff, a prototypical Dumb and Dumber relationship which first appeared in 1907. And almost as popular was the sublimely attractive Art Nouveau-styled Little Nemo strip by Winsor McCay. More than anyone else, McCay's work gave the lie to the idea that strips had no aesthetic merit. George Herriman's Crazy Cat strip started a 30-year run in 1913, and it featured not only a bizarre love-hate relationship and storylines that were the very definition of surreal, but characters and backgrounds which seemed to have come from an alternative universe. Herriman rejected the precision and detail of the kind found in Punch and Puck, and his characters bore little resemblance to the creatures they were supposed to be. And in this period, comic illustration for children's books was rapidly becoming the stylistic norm. William Heath Robinson published The Adventures of Uncle Lubin in 1902, and his pen and ink illustrations skillfully merged cartoon imagery with carefully studied anatomy and posing. His work for Bill the Minder in 1912 was equally memorable, and this book also featured some exquisite watercolour work. And New Zealander Harry Rowntree became massively successful in children's publishing, with his remarkable cartoon animals in both watercolour and ink. French cartoonist Georges Goursat was better known simply as Sem, and his work featured in just about every French magazine of the time, including Le Rire. Although absolutely organic and reminiscent of Toulouse-Lautrec's work, Sem was also pushing at the outer edges of the less is more philosophy. Other examples, such as J. Stuart Blackton's Blackboard animation from 1906, predate it, but the first real commercial animated success was Winsor McCay's Gertie the Dinosaur, first shown in the States in 1914. McCay drew thousands of separate images for his film, and even toured with Gertie and gave bogus commands to his animated character as you would to a trained horse. But back in Europe, fun was soon to be in very short supply. When war broke out in 1914, nobody realised just what a protracted and brutal fight they had signed up for. And yet, despite the appalling carnage, the British were determined to keep morale high with all kinds of cheerful cartoonery. Douglas Tempest created a large number of war-themed comic postcards, which incredibly were enthusiastically sent by and to troops in the trenches. Having been injured and invalided out from active service, Bruce Bairnsfather spent the rest of the war producing jocular cartoons set in the horrific conditions of trench war, which were featured in the magazine The Bystander. The man who had created Bill the Minder and Uncle Lubin, William Heath Robinson, also featured regularly in magazines, with his ridiculous take on how the war might be won through absurd technology. In France, Le Rire became Le Rire Rouge in recognition of the bloodiness of the conflict, and the covers and pages featured illustrations by several cartoonists, most notably the loose but expressive bitter humour of Charles Leandre. In 1918 the war finally ended, and as peace was restored everybody tried to pick up where they had left off and have a little fun. The animated series Out of the Inkwell was first shown that same year. The series was the creation of Max Fleischer, and the American public were highly entertained by the slapstick antics of Coco the Clown and other characters. A year later, the first animated star of the silent movies made his debut, and just like the real movie stars, his success was worldwide. Felix the Cat was drawn by Otto Meismer for Pat Sullivan's Studios. His physical makeup was dictated by what the animators found easiest to move around, and the success of his design made him an effective template for many later characters. In Britain, comic artists such as Heath Robinson and John Hassell were turning their attention to resolutely cheerful work which poked fun at everyday life. But not everyone was having fun. Germany had paid a heavy price for the war and found itself a completely divided society. This was chronicled by artist and cartoonist George Gross. His painted and drawn images looked like cartoons, but even though they were comical in their construction, in most cases you weren't supposed to laugh. The style movement we now call Art Deco had gathered momentum by the 20s, and although many cartoonists carried on regardless, there were also quite a few who were seduced by the modernist approach. Because he chose to remain in his hometown of Rio de Janeiro, José Carlos was far from being a household name, but his highly stylized editorial cartoon work embraced the Art Deco mindset with great success. And in America, John Held Jr. was also producing magazine work in a similar style, and like Carlos, in the majority of his illustrations, he satirized and celebrated the exuberance of the Jazz Age and the bright young things who populated it. In France, Le Rire had been supplanted by Le Sourire, and although it was better known for its erotic content, there was also plenty of humorous work from illustrators such as Maurice Pepin, known professionally as Pem. His work was highly decorative, and the light touch he brought to all his sexually comic images still looks distinctively stylish. The satirical magazine Crocodile was first published in the Soviet Union in 1922. Although satire and political comment of any kind was a risky business under the communist regime, Crocodile chose its targets with care and devoted a lot of its energy to making fun of Western capitalism and anyone else who opposed communist ideology. In 1928, the first animated film with synchronized sound was shown in America. The short musical animation was produced by the fledgling Walt Disney Studios, and it was the first film to feature Mickey Mouse. Audiences loved it immediately, and all other forms of cartoonery would forever take second place to animation in the public's affections. Up to this point, caricature had been almost exclusively used in political cartoons, but the global popularity of the movies saw a massive rise in good-natured caricatures of actors and other celebrities. Many caricaturists adopted a more radical, minimalist approach in their work, but arguably the most successful of these was Al Hirschfeld, whose graceful, aesthetically pleasing penwork led the field for decades to come. Betty Boop made her animated debut in 1930, and this odd hybrid character with her delicate body and rather grotesque large head was created by the Fleischer Studios, and the series, which featured innuendo-laced dialogue, proved highly successful with an adult audience. And although cartoonist E.C. Segar had created Popeye the Sailor in comic strip form in 1929, it was the Fleischers' animated films which made the spinach-eating hero a household name from its first showing in 1933. Many British cartoonists, such as Lawson Wood, ignored any prevailing changes in style. He had been working steadily since the First World War, but the 30s saw him rise to real prominence with his cheerful, skillfully executed paintings. And Wood was amongst a very select few whose work was popular in America. Less skillful, but no less popular in Britain at least, was the comic postcard work of Donald McGill. His success in this format was not only due to his comparatively basic but pleasing line and wash illustration style, but also his smutty humour and use of double entendres. Perhaps the most distinctive and modern stylist in 30s Britain was H.M. Bateman. His gleefully distorted characters and their frequently manic posing helped to reposition Punch magazine as a more contemporary and relevant publication. In 30s America, Vernon Grant had significant early success with his characters Snap, Crackle and Pop, who he designed for Kellogg's in 1933. His was a very modernist approach which generally played down tonal painting in favour of flat outline characters, more like those in animated films. And in the same time frame, Robert Reed had a successful if brief career with his precise, elegant cartoons, mostly gracing the covers of Collier's magazine. He had a particular way with female characters, and although he never got out of his narrow comfort zone, what he did produce was highly distinctive and stylish. In Britain, the exuberant cartoon creations of Roy Wilson dominated comic books. Wilson had worked his way up from being another cartoonist's assistant to being the comic artist everyone else aspired to be. In black and white or in colour, Wilson went to remarkable lengths to visually entertain his young readers. And to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street by Theodore Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss, was published in America in 1937. His illustrations cleverly transposed the kind of raucous imagery found in comic strips into the more sedate market of children's books. From the 20s onwards, Disney had been making animated shorts, each one more sophisticated and skillful than the one before. And in 1938 they released the first colour feature-length animated film, Snow White. Never before had such quality of design and animation been seen in an animated film, and it was an enormous global success. But only 20 years after the end of the First World War, another was about to begin. The rise of fascism and Germany's invasion of its neighbours made global conflict inevitable, and that seems like a suitably dramatic point at which to end this instalment of The Art of the Cartoon. See you next time, I hope.